Hello, I'm John David Ebert, and what I would like to do now is to move into a discussion of Camille Paglia's book, Sexual Personae, and go through that chapter by chapter. Um, Sexual Personae was published in 1990. It's a very large book, and it came out as Volume 1. It was originally proposed as a two-volume set. The volume that exists, I don't think the second volume ever appeared, covers classical culture, and the second volume was to cover only exclusively pop culture. But I think that somehow all that got melted in together into one volume and then into her subsequent essays over the remaining years. And the book began. Paglia was born in 1947, and she's third generation removed, I think, from Italian immigrants. So she comes from the Italian Catholic tradition, displaced to New York, grew up in New York, and so she's all in that world there, the New York culture sphere, which has its own kind of tenor, shape, and quality. And the original book was a study of the androgyne as her PhD thesis in the early 70s. I think in 1974 she had finished that under the tutelage of Harold Bloom at Yale University. Bloom is her mentor, and she describes her relationship between him as the relationship between the word and the image. Bloom is the Jewish, comes out of the Jewish tradition, is more interested in the Bible than in Homer. She comes out of the Greco-Roman tradition and is more interested in the world of the image and the flashy, showy theatricality, the Fellini-esque, carnivalesque nature of Italian and Hellenic culture generally, I think, as opposed to the more somber, direct culture of the word, beginning with the Hebrews and then which got displaced into Northern Europe. In Northern Europe, as she characterizes in her interview conversation with Neil Postman, Northern Europe is the realm of the word, Southern Europe is the realm of the image. So there is a sort of cultural shift there. I think even Toynbee, in a study of history, characterized them as Promethean versus Epimethean. The Promethean North is forward-thinking, the Epimethean South is backward-looking and remains more firmly chained and anchored to the traditions of antiquity than the North did. Now, so the thesis came out in 74. And then she wanted to expand it into a book. It had begun initially as a study of Amelia Earhart, but then she realized after reading Simone de Beauvoir's, The Second Sex, that that book impacted her in a big way, and she wanted to start thinking in bigger, larger cultural terms. So this became her project for a long time. And by 1981, Sexual Personae was finished, she says, but then couldn't find a publisher until 1990. The book came out in 1990, and I think it's significant that 4 years later, Harold Bloom then put out the Western Canon, which was the first book that really, I think, drew attention to his work outside of purely the world of academe. I think she kind of opened a door there for him. When the book came out, it was very popular and also very controversial. Paglia is a sort of anti-feminist feminist. She is a feminist, but doesn't fit well in the feminist world, and other feminists tend to deride her. So it's not a comfortable fit, but I think that friction makes for a lot of fun. Friction in culture is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. You need to have it. It's culturally productive. All these different points of view rubbing up against each other creates cultural fermentation and differing ideas that cross-fertilize, hybridize, and synthesize. If everybody is being nice to each other, nothing ever gets done, as in the New Age. This is the problem with the New Age, is that it's not critical of each other, with the exception of someone like, say, Ken Wilber, who's very critical of everyone else, but not of himself. And I think that's a big mistake for him. He should have been a little more critical about his own ideas, because I think he gets mired in a narcissistic world, thinking that the system that he has erected is the only valid system, and everyone else, geniuses like Heidegger and Jean Gebser, and somehow got it wrong. And he's the only guy in history to have gotten it right. That's just sheer narcissism that's off the radar there. But then, so she comes out of this classical humanities tradition, and so we've got Sexual Personae. And what I want to do is start by reading the canceled preface that was canceled by her publisher because the book was too long. Maybe they just felt it was superfluous, but I think it's very interesting. And she published it in a follow-up volume called Sex, Art, and American Culture, which is a series of very good essays. analyzing different figures like Robert Mapplethorpe and Elizabeth Taylor and so forth. So the essay can be found in there. And it's long. Paglia goes long. She's long-winded. She rambles around. The writing is not very disciplined. You might think of the American literary tradition as having these two poles where there's the tight constriction of a writer, somebody like Emily Dickinson, whose poetry is very tight and compact, compared to, let's say, Walt Whitman, who's very expansive and all over the place, or Jack Kerouac, also very expansive, all over the place. But certain American writers are very precise and concise. And I think Paglia comes out of this tradition of the expansive American writer who puts a lot into each paragraph, and subsequently the chapters are very long. But she begins this chapter by talking about the concept of what she means by personae, sexual personae. But first she mentions that she's going to frame everything in terms of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Now these are, of course, terms that she has taken from Nietzsche. And in Nietzsche, they represented the form-giving principles. And this comes out of The Birth of Tragedy. The form-giving principles, let's say, of sculpture, statue, the colonnade, as opposed to the darker Dionysian rituals that lay behind all of this, that involve human sacrifice, cults of the Bacchants running around, tearing animals apart. Nietzsche saw these two poles representing form and energy, basically the Dionysian currents of energy that swell through nature in chaos and destruction, as opposed to the tempering force of the form-giving Apollo. But Nietzsche, in turn, got these two principles from J.J. Bachofen, in whose book Mother Right. He was the first to present them with his idea of history as a series of three stages, and he was the first to come up with this idea that lying behind Rome in classical antiquity, there was a much older matriarchal tradition, the first phase of which he characterizes as recklessly sexually promiscuous, the Aphroditic Hetyric. The Hetyra is a sort of virago given over to sexual promiscuity, and this is the swamp-like characteristic. It corresponds to swamp-like vegetation. Aphrodite is the primary symbol there. This eventually gives way then to the rise of the realm of Hera, which is the matriarchal realm proper. Hera is the goddess of marriage. Marriage comes in as an institution. It has a tempering effect. The society is matriarchal, and now it's agricultural. And marriage has come in to control social relations. But then this degenerates back into the Dionysus cults, which generates back into sexual promiscuity and Aphroditic hetyrism. And then in response to that, we get the Apollonian culture with the rise of the Romans. And the Romans, they are the ones who, they're always descended from their fathers, not their mothers. Whereas Bachofen had noticed that in Lycia, for instance, that many of the people there describe themselves as being descendants of their mothers, not their fathers. So he knew there were matriarchal traditions interwoven inside of this culture. And so the Romans, and Bachofen points out that the Romans very often, if you look at their wars and conflicts, they're always fighting someone. Their enemy is usually a goddess-worshipping culture. That can't be a coincidence, such as the Carthaginians. They were goddess worshippers, or the Sabines, or a number of other cultures. Almost everyone the Romans fought seemed to have been goddess worshippers, whereas they were not. And he says that's significant, but because their wars and battles were really about the assertion of the Apollonian world of father right, with the rise of law and rationality and order coming in now with civilization. So this is where Nietzsche is coming out of with these terms now that Paglia takes over and reterritorializes for sexual personae, in which she says she wants these terms to represent, on the one hand, with Apollo form, but on the other hand, with Dionysus energy, especially dark, stonic, swamp-like nature and energy. So she's going to use those two terms as aesthetic principles to characterize her look back at the history of the Western canon. She doesn't make a distinction, though. She uses the term the West. And when she uses this term, she means what she's actually representing, I think, is three entirely separate civilizations that Spengler was the first to separate out clearly and neatly into the civilization of antiquity, the Greco-Roman civilization, then the Magian civilization, the Judeo-Christian Islamic civilization that comes out of that, and is partially affiliated to it, and then the Northwestern, what he calls Faustian civilization, that's heavily influenced by Scandinavian myth and culture, as a separate civilization. That's the civilization cycle of the West that we belong to. They're three very different civilizations, and I think she doesn't divide them. She just says she's talking about the West, and by the West, she really does mean Greco-Roman antiquity, because she sees a lot of popular culture as a resurgence of paganism. So it's very important, but I think there's an important distinction to be made here between these three civilizations and their three different ideas of subjectivity, because the self in each one of them is very different. And she sort of says, okay, well, the word persona, she's taking it from the title of Bergman's movie, Persona, but it really comes from Jung, where Jung used it to refer to the social mask that we wear in the realm of the big other, what Lacan called the big other, which is when we go out and we present ourselves in public or we're online. That's the public face. So it's a kind of outer shell, and it originally refers to the wooden masks worn by the Greeks during their plays. That was the persona, but it eventually came to mean the outer shell of the person. Jung makes a distinction, though, that I think Paglia fails to make here between the persona on the one hand, and then the ego that underlies that, which is one's personal sense of self. I think, I want, I this, I that, the critical function, the reality function, and then beneath that, the self. So we've got persona, ego, the self. And the self for Jung is a kind of retrieval of this sort of mystical Germanic idea that the self is a metaphysical subjectivity unto himself. Each person is a kind of world unto himself. And this is the creation of the subject in Scandinavian, Danish, Anglo-Saxon culture generally. It is that culture, as Franz Borkenau is the first to point out in his book End and Beginning, that was the first to separate in their language the pronoun from the verb. I think, therefore I am, is different from the way the cogito is in Latin. And the oldest inscription that we have from the north that shows this comes from a golden horn dating from 400 AD, in which on it is the inscription, I, Phlegistir from Holt, made this horn. So it was very important to this individual to point out what his name was, the fact that he made the horn, where he was from, and the fact that his I, ich, his Germanic sense of self, was different from the deed, made this horn. The two, prior to that point, had always been together, and they're not separated in Latin or in the Latin languages for a while. It takes a while for them to separate out when French separates out of the Latin base. But the Germans were the first to make this, and I think this is a metaphysical, transcendental personality that Paglia may not quite be clear about. She's talking about the persona as the Western sense of self. The West is the great civilization of personae. We love to flash our individuality and personalities everywhere. But I think that there's some distinctions that need to be made. Whereas with Jung, we have the persona, the ego, and the self. And the self is that metaphysical, transcendental thing that the Germans had already figured out, that doesn't exist in the Magian civilization. The Judeo-Christian Islamic civilization is always a we. It's always a community. It's always based on consensus. We. There is no sense of individuality in the Magian world. You're always part of a tribe, a group that shares a set of consensus beliefs that is bound together by a spiritual principle, the pneuma, the spirit that descends down into the psyche and bonds and holds the community together. And you are a part of one or another of these warring consensus communities. There's a very different idea of subjectivity there from the Germanic sense of the self, or even from the Greco-Roman sense of the self, which really is pretty shallow. It really is just amounts to the persona. When you're reading Greek poetry, Greek lyric poetry is always addressed to an other, to a you. The idea of a Hamlet-style monologue simply doesn't exist in Greek drama or in any of the Greek lyric writings. That's an invention of the North, the Faustian, Hamletian monologue of the transcendental subject lost in the Gothic interior of his own self. That's something new and very different. I make this distinction because Paglia says that she's going to focus on the persona, but she also believes that beyond it is the biological self. And I think the biological self is even different from all of these other selves. That the biological self, which I tend to agree with here with her, that the human beings are not a blank slate at all. We're not a tabula rasa at all. But this is the 5 million-year-old man monkey, basically, the man monkey that lives within all of us hominids, basically, that has certain biologically constricting hormones and brain structures and so forth that constrict and nail the personality down in such a way that it's always anchored in the certain behavior patterns that are common to the species Homo, the hominid species, right down the line. That's a different subjectivity. That's a different kind of self there. But I do tend to agree with her that she's going to say and argue. She goes on in this chapter to point out that she differs from most feminists in believing that men and women are biologically totally different. They are prisoners of their hormones. Testosterone, men have way more testosterone than women do, and testosterone indicates, it activates, it's the basis of male rage and predatory sexuality and male lust and aggression and so forth, whereas with women, estrogen predominates, and estrogen tranquilizes, neutralizes, and tranquilizes and calms. There's a certain activity to the male and a certain receptivity and passivity to the female, or what I guess Jordan Peterson would call agreeableness. Women, he says in that interview with I forget what her name was, the British woman, where he says that women are just more agreeable than men. I think that's true by and large, but these are biologically based. And she's going to argue that there is a biologically based subjectivity that makes human beings what they are as men and women, very radically subjectively different. She identifies as transgender. She says that growing up, she was very feminist in the traditional sense, lesbian, but it took her a while to sort of realize that she can't escape her hormones, or essentially female nature, even though she doesn't feel female, and tends to identify more psychologically with the male and biologically with the female. So there's going to be a lot of playing around with that and with these archetypes. She likes Jung, and she's come out of the background where she's read Jung and Erich Neumann and Spengler. Doesn't, for some odd reason, like Joseph Campbell. She points out she doesn't like Joseph Campbell at all. She found him mawkish and sentimental, which I suppose is true to a certain extent, but she says that he did bad research, and that's simply wrong. That's wrong. Campbell, nobody did better research than Joseph Campbell. He was a master of research. If you look in the back of each volume of the Masks of God, there are quite a few footnotes. But this guy read books and was very good at research. Very few people were as encyclopedically well read as Joseph Campbell, so that opinion simply doesn't work. But I understand the mawkish aspect, this appeal there. And she says for some reason that Campbell also was popular with American feminists, which may or may not be true, but he was certainly a chauvinist. Campbell believed that women had their place and men had their place, and that it should stay that way for the most part, and that women could do creative things, but that they had to make a bigger sacrifice than men did, than men do when they do culture. For him, men were always culture, women were always nature. So he had a dichotomy too that was essentialist. And so Paglia is an essentialist, and it's admittedly old-fashioned in that sense, while also being a feminist. So there's a very interesting mix of cultural elements in what she's going to do. So she says what she's going to do then is an old-fashioned cultural critique where she's going to bring in art and aesthetics. She says too many feminists are indifferent to aesthetics. They don't pay attention to art history. They're not very well read, and they're mostly reacting out of their emotionality. They're thinking with their emotions instead of with their brains. And they're just not very well read. And she was disillusioned with Susan Sontag after a certain point. There's a lot of uncomfortable, there's a lot of frisson in Paglia, I think. So she's going to proceed to do this sort of old-fashioned cultural analysis of looking for hidden sexual themes in the traditional history of the West. Lots of pornography that she thinks is hidden in there, and lots of paganism that's hidden in there. Paganism, according to her, never died, and it most certainly resurged with the explosion of popular culture, which she sees as the resurgence of paganism. Terence McKenna saw it that way too in his book, The Archaic Revival, I remember. And So it's going to be an old-fashioned cultural critique, and she wants to present it as though we were sort of walking through the Metropolitan Museum of Art and looking at these ancient cultures and how they interact with contemporary society. So we'll begin there.